Welcome to State Scoop's Priorities Podcast. Every Wednesday, you'll get insights into the state and local government community, hear from top leaders, and learn about the latest news and trends across the industry. I'm Keely Quinlan, a reporter with State Scoop. Here's what's happening this week. Local lawmakers in New Orleans are set to consider a proposal at the end of the month from police that would allow for broad use of facial recognition technology during investigations. The proposal comes after a Washington Post investigation last month that showed police have already been using the technology against current city policy and amid concerns around the technology's impact on civil rights. Bill Kehoe, Washington's chief information officer, said in an interview with State Scoop that when funding from the state and local cybersecurity program ends, either in 2 years after expiring naturally or even sooner due to federal cuts by the Trump administration, state governments will have to collaborate more closely with their municipalities. The grant money, he said, has provided rural communities in the state with much needed funding. After an extensive effort last year to examine her state's technological shortcomings, Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders last week issued an executive order that will rearrange the state's IT efforts and place a greater emphasis on cybersecurity. The order requires the state's IT division to reform as the Department of Shared Administrative Services, Office of State Technology. This week, I interviewed Chad Marlow, a senior policy counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, who researches public safety technology, about the proposal in New Orleans that would allow police to use facial recognition technology to assist in criminal investigations. While there are several safeguards built into the proposal limiting its use, it comes after the investigation by the Washington Post, which found police were not respecting the city's limitations on using facial recognition technology. Marlow raises several concerns about its impact on individuals and their rights amid an increase in recent aggressive immigration enforcement activities across the country. Marlow provides an overview of what makes this proposal different from those considered in other cities in recent years, and why it would give the New Orleans police the most unfettered use of facial recognition technology so far.
I think that our kind of worst case scenario for surveillance is, we're all extremely influenced by George Orwell's 1984 book. The idea that Big Brother, his name for the government entity, is literally watching us all the time. And I think that, as we proceed, into the 21st century, we do have a sense that we are being watched more and more. But in New Orleans, we are actually literally talking about watching people all the time. And again, when we're talking about facial recognition, it's more than just a camera is looking at you all the time, which, has a pretty significant ick factor as it is. But when you add facial recognition, you actually have a technology that isn't just watching all the time. It's watching you all the time because it knows who you are. And what that means is then when you go from one camera to another that is watching you, it has the ability to stitch that together and say, oh, look, Keely was there. Now she's here. Now she's over here and she's speaking to 3 other people, and I can identify all of them as well. So now I know who she's meeting with. Oh, I just lost track of her because she walked into that house. And what does that say on the outside? Psychiatrist's office or AA meeting. And so you can imagine that this kind of constant watching really kind of eviscerates all concepts of anonymity in public. And I think that is something that is important to people kind of in the background. It's not something they think about all the time. But when you tell people, when you are in public, we are always going to know where you are and who you are meeting with and where you are going, it starts to have an effect on the choices that we make. Is it safe to go here? Is it safe to meet with those people? Do I want to go to a meeting and have people who I don't even know about it and recording that? So it really just does change your life in a pretty dramatic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as I'm sure you know, probably because we've talked about it, the Washington Post last month published an investigation which uncovered that the New Orleans Police Department had already been using this technology without approval for the last several years. What was your reaction to that? I mean, was this more like surprising, or was it indicative of, you think, like maybe a larger problem with the usage of this technology by law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, so in New Orleans in particular, it was stunning. And the reason why is because of, the work I do. I work on privacy and surveillance and technology issues for the ACLU. I thought to myself immediately, am I wrong? Or didn't New Orleans ban that sort of use of facial recognition technology a couple of years ago? So I immediately went running online and looked it up, and I'm like, oh my God, they did. So it wasn't just a kind of a policy reaction, which of course I had, which is this is a terrible idea and a terribly dangerous idea, but it was also they're violating their own law in doing it. And you can't help but think to yourself, the only thing worse than a police department using real-time facial recognition technology is a police department using real-time facial recognition technology who doesn't seem particularly interested in following the laws that apply to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you mentioned the ACLU, of course, has been raising the alarm about these issues for several years with different reports. Your work, of course, has been crucial and central to that, about all sorts of surveillance technologies. But I guess something that I would love for you to explain is like, what is it about facial recognition technology as opposed to other types of biometric identity verification methods that is so concerning?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a lot of different biometric identification technologies, all of which are pretty scary. I think the thing that makes facial recognition particularly scary is that it is probably next to fingerprints, probably the most common one we're seeing nowadays, and it's also probably the easiest to capture. Getting an iris scan or a gait scan, how someone walks actually can be pretty unique to who they are all pretty frightening. But I think there are two things with facial recognition in particular that are troubling. And I want to point out that either one of them by themselves would be enough for me to say we should not be using this technology. The fact that they operate together is even worse. So the first is the inaccuracy of it. Facial recognition technology is good, but it's not great. And it also has particularly high fail rates with certain groups of people. Persons of color, black and brown skinned people, it does not work as accurately. It doesn't work as accurately with women. It doesn't work as accurately with very young and very old people because those are two stages in life in which your face geometry changes quite a bit because of aging. In short, it can identify me pretty well, as a white male, in my 50s. But a lot of other groups it doesn't identify particularly well. And the way that plays out in the real world is it makes it more likely that the technology is going to find that your face matches that of a wanted suspect when it actually doesn't. And when you layer in on top of that, like let's take, a black man. Let's take a black man in Detroit because that has happened multiple times where you have a black man who has done absolutely nothing wrong, who has the police pull up at his house. I mean, I can't forget the horrifying case of the ACLU's client, Robert Williams, where the police pulled up in front of his wife and his two young kids and arrested him for something he didn't do and took him off to jail. That is a real risk this technology creates. And there have been efforts to suggest that it is getting better. And while it may be, statements that it is highly accurate are more of a product of flaws in the testing methods than it is improvements in the technology. One organization called NIST finds that the technology works if it produces a list of 100 potential matches and the 100th most likely match turns out to be the person, they say that's a successful match. Whereas in the real world, it wouldn't be a successful match at all because the police are going to focus in on the top 2 or 3 most likely hits, not number 100. So that's the first problem, that the technology is not particularly accurate, particularly with respect to vulnerable groups who already suffer from over-policing. The second is, and the irony about the second one is, if you actually fix the first one, it makes the second one even more problematic, is just the fact that it has the ability to completely eviscerate privacy in public. I often tell people who are trying to conceptualize it that a well operating system of surveillance cameras with facial recognition technology creates the equivalent of forcing every one of us when we leave our house to wear a shirt with a blown up picture of our driver's license on it and to carry a government issued GPS tracking device. And the reason that is the case is because when it sees you with the technology, it can identify who you are. It can link that to your home address and other, attributes, your weight, your height, all those sort of things. And then it can track you where you go, right? So if the government were to come to us and were to say, we are going to pass legislation that requires you to wear that T-shirt with your driver's license on it and carry a GPS tracking device that the government can track you, people would say, are you out of your mind? There is no way we would do that. But when they envelop it in technology and just say it's surveillance cameras with facial recognition technology, for some reason people have a slightly different or more passive reaction to it, and they should not.
Yeah, yeah. No, those are important points. I really like the visual of having like your license, driver's license on your shirt. I think that'll definitely catch some attention.
I hope
Um,
so.
I just to play devil's advocate for a moment, because there are, some safeguards built into this proposal, based off of my reading of it. What would you say to somebody who is like, well, there are, guardrails built into this proposed, ordinance, which includes limited use cases, which includes, not allowing a match to be, the only a match alone to serve as probable cause enough to effectuate an arrest. What would you say to somebody who is like, well, there's all these things, that would protect somebody, safety and privacy and things like that?
Yeah, so I think there's two things I would say about the guardrails. The first is, when was the last time, and Keely, you may not be the right person to ask it to because you're a journalist and you do these sort
Uh-oh.
of things like I do. But when was the last time the average person actually read a city council law, right?
Yeah.
So you are going to know that there's cameras. You're going to know that they have facial recognition, that they're identifying you all over the place, but you're not necessarily going to know that there's a provision in section 2AB single I that says that they can't use it for this purpose. So the result of that is you have the chilling effect on people's behaviors because they don't necessarily know what the limitations are. Second point to that is, if I just read a Washington Post article that told me that that police department doesn't follow city council limitations because, after all, it's using the facial recognition completely against a currently existing city law, then what gives me the confidence that they're going to actually follow the limitations in the new law? They kind of have a very bad record when it comes to following facial recognition technology limitations already. So that doesn't give me a lot of confidence. And the third thing is, even if you want to do that double leap of faith that the New Orleans Police Department is going to abide by those laws and that the people can trust them to abide by those laws, when you collect surveillance data on people and you don't lock it down in unbelievable ways, and in some ways you can't lock it down in ways because any other government that gets a warrant can get access to it, you have to remember that local city council laws only apply to local agencies and local actors. And so even if you are protected from the New Orleans Police Department, anyone else who gets access to that data, and there's rampant data sharing, either because people just give someone says, I'd like to have it, and they say, here it is, or they share it with the fusion center where lots of different law enforcement gets access to, or they come with the warrant. It can go in lots of places where those city council limitations no longer apply. So again, not a lot of comfort there to go around.
Yeah, definitely. Um, those are really great points. And something I'd obviously be remiss if I didn't touch on, is why why is this uniquely worrisome right now? I know that, contextually we're seeing, an increase in immigration enforcement, and obviously, um, people are standing up against that as well. It's a tense time. So why is this? I guess why does this present such a problem right now? With federal authorities conducting themselves in the way that they are.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, when I heard about what New Orleans was doing in this proposal to bring in this facial recognition, I thought to myself, this is not only a really bad idea, but it's just about the worst time I could think to do this really bad idea. And I know in New Orleans that they're talking a lot about that they had a jailbreak, several weeks ago. I might start by not, hardening my jails with drywall, but that's a whole nother discussion. But so they're thinking we need this because people are breaking out of our jails. Well, I would say that a jailbreak is a once in a decade or a once in a several decade occurrence. So let's not over respond to a rare event. It would be like me planning a worldwide trip because I'm planning on winning the Mega Millions lottery jackpot. I don't really think the planning necessitates the rarity of the event potentially occurring. But what I would say is that, in this case, what should the city council of New Orleans really be thinking about? If they want to talk about the jailbreak, by all means, talk about the jailbreak. But let's talk about other things that are going on in this country right now, right? We know that that there are people in this country all over the place that are trying to find people who are seeking abortion care or gender affirming care and to prosecute them under the law. We know that there are obviously unbelievable attempts to go after hardworking, undocumented persons who have done nothing wrong other than the crime of trying to create a better life for themselves and their families, and go after them. We know that the government is threatening political protesters. We don't have to imagine it. You can look at what's going on in Los Angeles. You can listen to the words of President Trump when he says we are going to use force against anyone who protests his military parade. Fortunately, that was avoided because no one showed up at it. But this is the circumstance that the New Orleans City Council needs to realize. If they set up this system in their city, they cannot insulate it from these other bad actors. We know of cases with license plate readers recently where the state of Texas went into Illinois without that state's knowledge and grabbed that data to go after abortion care seekers and undocumented persons in Illinois. What would possibly make the New Orleans City Council think that they can keep their people safe from another state or a federal government who all they have to say is, I think these people are committing a crime, right? Abortion care seeking or gender affirming care is illegal in my state, so I have a warrant for that data. I think that those political protesters are engaged in violence, so I have a warrant. I think they're insurrectionists, so I have a warrant. So when they set this up, they cannot keep these other bad actors at bay. And in fact, it's even worse than that. The City Council of New Orleans needs to know, because they're worried about a once-in-a-decade jailbreak, that they are actually inviting these actors in New Orleans. They are saying, if you want to go after abortion care seekers or gender affirming care speakers or political protesters or undocumented persons, why not start in the city that has the surveillance in place and that is collecting the data that will make your job as easy as possible? So they are inviting these bad actors into the city to go after their population. And they're also, incidentally, scaring the bejesus out of international tourists who may want to go to New Orleans. International tourists are already becoming increasingly afraid to come to the United States because of this authoritarian bent. Why would they go to the city that creates the greatest danger for them? So the New Orleans City Council can live in a bubble and think, oh, we just want to use this technology to go after people who've committed heinous crimes or broken out of jail, and we can pass a law that will keep everyone safe. That is pure fantasy. What they are actually doing is putting every single resident in New Orleans at risk and every single visitor of New Orleans at risk. And these risks are real, and all they have to do is look outside their window to see them happening in our country right now. So, I would say it is absolutely the height of irresponsibility for the New York City Council to even be thinking about doing this, given the level of danger that exists in our country at this time. Whether or not that message reaches them, I don't know if it will, but I am, quietly confident, or at least hopeful, that it will. Because if they want to keep people safe, unfortunately, people breaking out of jail are not the biggest risk to the people of New Orleans. Other government actors who don't share New Orleans values are. And I think they should start there in their deliberative process.
That was Chad Marlow from the ACLU. Thanks to him and the ACLU for their participation in this conversation. And that's it for this episode. You can subscribe to the Priorities Podcast at prioritiespodcast.com. This recording is a production of Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Thanks to Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher for helping put it all together. And I'm Keely Quinlan. Thanks for listening.